The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Chen's corner office on the 42nd floor, each droplet catching the amber glow of the city lights below. The sound should have been soothing, but tonight it felt like an accusation, a relentless reminder of everyone caught without shelter in the storm raging outside. Marcus loosened his silk tie, the weight of another 16-hour day pressing against his shoulders like a physical burden. His reflection stared back from the dark glass. A successful man in an expensive suit who had climbed from nothing to everything, yet somehow felt emptier with each passing year. If you've ever wondered what happens when success becomes a prison of its own making, stay with me, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about wealth, worth, and the bridges we build between worlds. The elevator descended in silence, carrying Marcus toward the underground garage where his Tesla waited like a sleek promise of escape. But as the doors opened onto the concrete cavern of level B2, he noticed something that made him pause. There, in the corner where the security cameras had a blind spot, someone had built a small shelter from cardboard boxes and plastic sheeting. The structure was ingenious in its simplicity, designed to catch warmth from the building's heating vents while remaining invisible to casual observers. Marcus had walked past this spot every day for 3 years, but tonight, perhaps because of the storm, or perhaps because his own loneliness had finally reached a breaking point, he found himself moving toward the makeshift home instead of his car. "Excuse me," Marcus called softly, not wanting to startle whoever might be inside. The cardboard rustled, and a man emerged, his movements careful and dignified despite his circumstances. He was perhaps 50, with graying hair and eyes that held the kind of intelligence that couldn't be dimmed by hardship. His clothes were clean but worn, patched in places with the precision of someone who took pride in his appearance regardless of his situation. Most striking was the small notebook he clutched in his weathered hands, its pages filled with what looked like architectural sketches and mathematical calculations. "I'm sorry, sir," the man said, his voice carrying the refined cadence of education. "I know I shouldn't be here. I'll pack up and move along." He began folding his cardboard walls with practiced efficiency, each movement economical and purposeful. There was no self-pity in his manner, no attempt to evoke sympathy, just the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to navigate a world that had forgotten him. "Wait," Marcus said, surprising himself. "What's your name?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither man fully understood yet. The homeless man paused in his packing, studying Marcus with eyes that seemed to see through the expensive suit to something deeper underneath. "David," he replied after a moment. "David Thornton." The name carried weight, as if it belonged to someone who had once commanded respect in boardrooms and lecture halls. Marcus felt a strange recognition, though he couldn't place where he might have heard it before. "I'm Marcus Chen." He gestured toward the shelter. "How long have you been staying here?" The question was gentle, free of judgment, and David seemed to sense the genuine curiosity behind it. 3 months, David said, his voice steady. "Since the university let me go." He held up the notebook, its pages fluttering slightly in the artificial breeze from the ventilation system. "I'm an architect, or I was. 30 years of designing buildings that would last centuries. And then one day they decided my ideas were too expensive, too idealistic." His laugh held no bitterness, only the weary acceptance of someone who had learned that the world could change the rules without warning. Marcus found himself drawn to the sketches visible in the notebook's open pages. Even in the harsh fluorescent light of the garage, he could see the elegance of the designs, the way each line served both function and beauty. These weren't the work of someone whose mind had been dulled by hardship. They were the creations of a visionary who had simply been discarded by a system that valued profit over innovation. "Show me," Marcus said, nodding toward the notebook. David hesitated for a moment, then opened it fully, revealing page after page of architectural marvels. There were designs for affordable housing that looked like art installations, community centers that seemed to grow organically from their surroundings, and office buildings that incorporated nature so seamlessly they appeared to breathe. Each sketch was annotated with notes about sustainable materials, energy efficiency, and cost-effective construction methods. "This one," David said, pointing to a particularly striking design, "is for transitional housing. Not just shelter, but homes that help people rebuild their dignity while they get back on their feet." His finger traced the clean lines of the structure, and Marcus could see how every detail had been considered with both compassion and practicality. The construction cost would be 60% less than traditional methods, but the psychological impact would be immeasurable. Marcus stared at the drawings, feeling something shift inside his chest. Here was exactly what his foundation had been searching for, the missing piece that could transform their charitable efforts from mere band-aids into genuine solutions. For months, his team had been struggling to find architects who understood both the practical and emotional needs of displaced populations. Most firms either produced soulless boxes or beautiful structures that cost more than the people they were meant to help could ever afford. David," Marcus said slowly, "what if I told you I've been looking for someone exactly like you?" The words felt strange in his mouth, as if he were speaking a language he had forgotten he knew. David's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't allow hope to creep into his expression. Too many promises had been broken, too many opportunities had evaporated like morning mist. "I'd say that sounds too good to be true," David replied with a sad smile. "And I've learned that when something sounds too good to be true, it usually is." He began closing the notebook, but Marcus reached out and gently stopped him. "My foundation has been trying to develop affordable housing projects for 2 years, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength as the idea took shape. "We have the funding, we have the land, but we've been missing the vision. Every architect we've consulted has given us either charity boxes or luxury dreams. You've found the middle ground." He paused, studying David's face for any sign of recognition. "I want to offer you a job." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant hum of the building's mechanical systems and the continued drumming of rain against the concrete structure above them. David's hand trembled slightly as he gripped his notebook, and for the first time since Marcus had approached him, his composure cracked just enough to reveal the vulnerability beneath. "A job," David repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. "Doing what exactly?" His voice was carefully neutral, but Marcus could hear the thread of desperate hope he was trying to suppress. "Designing the future," Marcus said simply. "Leading our architectural team, turning those sketches into reality, creating homes that don't just shelter bodies but heal spirits." He pulled out his business card, the thick paper catching the light as he handed it to David. "My foundation, Chen Humanitarian Initiatives, has a budget of $50 million earmarked for housing projects. What I'm offering you isn't charity, it's partnership." David took the card with hands that shook slightly, reading it twice before looking back up at Marcus. "Why?" he asked, and the question contained multitudes. Why him? Why now? Why would a successful businessman offer such an opportunity to someone society had written off as worthless? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer a question that touched the deepest parts of his own story. "Because 15 years ago I was sleeping in a shelter downtown," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because someone gave me a chance when I had nothing but ideas and determination. Because I've learned that the most innovative solutions often come from people who have lived the problems firsthand." The revelation hung between them like a bridge suddenly made visible, connecting two men who had traveled vastly different paths to arrive at this moment in an underground garage. David's eyes searched Marcus's face, looking for signs of deception or pity, but finding only recognition and respect. "I don't have an address," David said quietly. "No phone, no references, no way to prove I'm who I say I am." The practical obstacles seemed to pile up between them like debris, threatening to block the path forward before it could be fully formed. "We'll figure that out," Marcus replied. "Tomorrow morning, meet me at the Marriott downtown. I'll get you a room for the week while we sort out the details. Bring your notebook and any other work you have. I want my team to see what real innovation looks like." He paused, then added with a smile that transformed his entire face, "And David, bring your appetite. We're going to have a lot to discuss over breakfast." As Marcus drove home through the storm, his mind raced with possibilities. The Foundation's board meeting was scheduled for Thursday, just 3 days away, and he knew presenting David's work would require careful preparation. The board members were good people, but they were also practical business people who would need to see concrete plans and realistic budgets before they would approve such an unconventional hiring decision. David spent that night in his cardboard shelter, but for the first time in months, he wasn't planning his next meal or worrying about where he would sleep tomorrow. Instead, he was refining his designs, adding details and annotations that would help others understand his vision. The notebook that had been his only companion through the darkest months of his life was about to become the blueprint for transformation, not just for the people who would live in the buildings he designed, but for everyone who would witness what was possible when society chose to invest in human potential rather than simply managing human problems. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, the storm having washed the city clean and left the air sharp with possibility. Marcus arrived at the Marriott early, checking David into a suite on the 20th floor with views of the downtown skyline. When David emerged from the elevator at 9 o'clock, he was transformed. He had found time to visit a barber and had somehow acquired a clean shirt and pressed slacks. His notebook was tucked under his arm like a briefcase, and his bearing was that of a professional ready to change the world. "I've been thinking about your foundation's mission," David said, as they settled into a corner booth at the hotel restaurant. "Affordable housing is just the beginning. What if we created entire communities, places where people don't just live, but thrive?" He opened his notebook to a new section Marcus hadn't seen the night before, revealing designs for integrated communities that included not just housing, but educational spaces, community gardens, small business incubators, and healthcare facilities. Marcus studied the drawings, his excitement building with each page. Here was someone who understood that poverty wasn't just about lack of money, but about lack of opportunity, lack of community, lack of hope. David's designs addressed all of these needs with an elegance that made complex solutions look simple. The construction timeline would be 18 months for the first phase, David continued, his voice gaining confidence as he explained his vision. "We could house 200 families initially, with infrastructure designed to support expansion to 500 units within 5 years. The key is starting with a core community that can mentor and support new residents as they arrive." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the restaurant's entrance. A woman in an expensive suit was arguing with the hostess, her voice carrying across the dining room with the entitled tone of someone accustomed to getting her way immediately. "I don't care if you're fully booked," the woman was saying. "Do you know who I am? I'm Victoria Ashford from Ashford Development. We're considering this hotel for our corporate events, but if this is the level of service we can expect..." Her threat hung in the air like a sword, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten with recognition. Victoria Ashford was more than just another developer. She was the woman whose company had systematically bought up affordable housing in the city and converted it to luxury condos, displacing hundreds of families in the process. Her developments were architectural marvels, but they were also monuments to inequality, beautiful buildings that served as barriers between the wealthy and everyone else. What Marcus didn't know, and what David was about to reveal, was that Victoria Ashford was also his former employer, the person who had fired him for refusing to design buildings that prioritized profit over people. The recognition was mutual and immediate when Victoria's eyes fell on David, sitting across from Marcus. "Well, well," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she approached their table. "David Thornton, I heard you were having some difficulties adjusting to your new circumstances." Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and Marcus felt the temperature at their table drop several degrees. "Victoria," David replied calmly, though Marcus could see his hands tighten around his coffee cup. "Still building monuments to greed, I see." The comment was delivered without heat, but its accuracy made Victoria's facade crack slightly. "At least I'm building something," she shot back. "What have you been doing lately, besides living in parking garages? I mean..." The cruelty of the comment was breathtaking, and Marcus felt anger rise in his chest like a tide. But before he could speak, David's response surprised them both. "I've been designing the future," David said quietly, closing his notebook and meeting Victoria's gaze directly. "The same future you've been trying to prevent." There was no anger in his voice, only sadness for opportunities lost and communities destroyed. Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The future? David, you're living in a fantasy. Nobody wants affordable housing that looks like art projects. People want luxury, exclusivity, status. That's what sells, that's what works, that's what pays the bills." She gestured dismissively at his notebook. "Your idealistic designs are beautiful, I'll give you that, but they're completely impractical in the real world." "Actually," Marcus said, standing up and extending his hand to Victoria, "I think you'll find that the real world is more ready for change than you imagine." Marcus Chen Humanitarian Initiatives. And David here is about to prove that beautiful, affordable housing isn't just possible, it's profitable. Victoria's expression shifted as she recognized Marcus's name. Chen Humanitarian Initiatives was one of the largest charitable foundations in the state, with enough influence to make or break development projects throughout the region. Her dismissive smirk faltered as she realized she might have just insulted someone whose support could be valuable to her own projects. "Mr. Chen," she said, her tone immediately more respectful, "I didn't realize. I'm sure David's work has its merits, but surely you understand the practical constraints of large-scale development. The regulatory hurdles alone." She was backpedaling now, trying to find a way to salvage the situation without completely abandoning her position. "The regulatory hurdles," Marcus replied smoothly, "are often the result of developers who prioritize speed and profit over community input and sustainable design." David's approach addresses those concerns proactively. He gestured for Victoria to join them, curious to see how she would respond to a direct challenge. What happened next would become the moment that defined not just the future of Marcus's foundation, but the entire trajectory of affordable housing development in the city. Victoria, recognizing that she was outnumbered but unwilling to concede defeat, made a proposal that surprised everyone. "Fine," she said, sliding into the booth beside Marcus. "Let's settle this properly. I propose a competition. Give us both the same budget, the same timeline, the same piece of land. Let's see whose vision actually works in practice." Her eyes glittered with competitive fire, and Marcus could see that she was confident her experience and resources would easily overcome David's idealistic designs. David looked at Marcus, a question in his eyes. This wasn't what either of them had planned, but it was an opportunity to prove their approach on a scale that would be impossible to ignore. Marcus found himself nodding before he had fully thought through the implications. "Agreed," Marcus said, "but with conditions. The projects will be evaluated not just on cost and timeline, but on community impact, environmental sustainability, and long-term viability. And the residents themselves will have a voice in determining which approach better serves their needs." Victoria's smile was predatory. "Perfect. I assume you'll want to make this interesting. Winner takes all the foundation's housing budget for the next 5 years. The stakes she was proposing were enormous, representing hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of lives that would be affected by the outcome. "Deal," Marcus said, though he could see David's face pale slightly at the magnitude of what they were committing to. 6 months to design, 6 months to build, 6 months to evaluate. The community decides the winner. As Victoria left their table with a triumphant smile, Marcus turned to David and saw not fear, but determination. "Are you sure about this?" David asked quietly. "She has resources, connections, an entire company behind her. All we have is—" He gestured at his notebook. "All we have," Marcus finished, "is the right idea at the right time and the courage to see it through. Sometimes that's enough." He paused, then added with a grin that reminded David why he had trusted this stranger in the first place. "Besides, I didn't build a $50 million foundation by playing it safe." The next 3 months passed in a blur of activity that transformed both men in ways they hadn't expected. Marcus discovered that his business acumen, combined with David's visionary designs, created a synergy that made seemingly impossible things feel inevitable. David found that his years of homelessness had given him insights into community building that no architecture school could have taught. The design process was unlike anything either had experienced before. Instead of working in isolation, they spent weeks in the neighborhoods where their buildings would be constructed, talking to residents, understanding their needs, learning about the informal networks that kept communities functioning. David's sketches evolved from beautiful concepts into living blueprints that reflected the wisdom of people who had learned to create homes from hope and determination. Meanwhile, Victoria's team was working with characteristic efficiency, producing sleek renderings and detailed construction plans that impressed city officials and investors alike. Her buildings were undeniably beautiful, glass and steel towers that would have looked at home in any luxury development. But when community members were invited to review the competing proposals, the differences became stark. "Where are the children supposed to play?" asked Maria Santos, a single mother who had been living in temporary housing for 8 months. She was looking at Victoria's proposal, with its emphasis on maximizing unit density and minimizing common areas. "Where do we hang laundry? Where do we grow food? Where do we gather when someone needs help?" David's proposal answered all of these questions and more. His buildings were designed around courtyards that served as community hearts, with spaces for children to play safely while parents could supervise from their windows. Rooftop gardens provided both food security and gathering spaces. Ground floor areas were designed to accommodate small businesses, creating economic opportunities within the community itself. But the real test came when construction began. Victoria's team moved with industrial precision, bringing in crews and equipment that transformed the construction site into a model of efficiency. Her building rose quickly, its steel frame reaching toward the sky like a monument to human ambition. David and Marcus took a different approach. They hired locally whenever possible, training community members in construction skills that would serve them long after the building was complete. Their progress was slower, but each day brought new connections between the builders and the future residents. The breakthrough moment came during the 4th month of construction, when a late-night fire at Victoria's site revealed a critical flaw in her approach. The blaze, caused by faulty electrical work installed by the lowest bidder, damaged 3 floors and set the project back by weeks. More importantly, it raised questions about the safety standards that had been compromised in the rush to minimize costs. David's response to the crisis surprised everyone, including Victoria herself. Instead of using the setback to gain advantage, he offered to share his safety protocols and even loan some of his crew to help with the repairs. The gesture was reported in the local media, but more importantly, it was witnessed by the community members who would ultimately judge the competition. "Why would you help your competitor?" a reporter asked David during a site visit. The question was broadcast on the evening news, and David's answer became the moment that defined not just the competition, but the entire conversation about affordable housing in the city. "Because this isn't about winning or losing," David replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned wisdom through hardship. "It's about creating homes for people who need them, If Victoria's building is safer because we shared our knowledge, then the families who live there are better protected. That's not competition, that's community. The comment went viral on social media, shared thousands of times by people who were hungry for examples of cooperation in a world that seemed increasingly divided. But more importantly, it reached the attention of someone who would change everything, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the city's new director of housing development, who had been quietly observing both projects from the beginning. Dr. Rodriguez had a secret that neither Marcus nor Victoria knew. She had been homeless herself as a teenager, aging out of the foster care system with nowhere to go and no one to help her navigate the transition to adulthood. Her PhD in urban planning and her position in city government were the result of a journey that had taken her from sleeping in bus stations to designing policy that would affect thousands of lives. When Dr. Rodriguez announced that the city would be expanding its affordable housing initiative to include 10 additional sites, both Marcus and Victoria assumed they were competing for the same prize. What they didn't realize was that Dr. Rodriguez had been watching not just their buildings, but their approaches to community engagement, worker treatment, and long-term sustainability. The announcement came at a community meeting held in the partially completed common area of David's building. Residents from both projects were present, along with city officials, media representatives, and curious neighbors who had been following the competition through local news coverage. Before we announce the results of this competition, Dr. Rodriguez began, "I want to share something with you. 18 years ago, I was living in my car trying to finish high school while working 2 jobs to pay for gas and food. I know what it feels like to be invisible, to be written off, to be seen as a problem rather than a person with potential." The room was completely silent, the weight of her revelation settling over the audience like a blanket. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat, perhaps beginning to understand that this evaluation would be based on criteria she hadn't considered. "I've been watching both of these projects closely," Dr. Rodriguez continued, "and I've learned something important. This was never really a competition between 2 buildings. It was a demonstration of 2 completely different philosophies about what housing means and what communities need." She gestured toward the windows, where both buildings were visible in various stages of completion. "Victoria's building is beautiful, efficient, and will provide quality housing for 200 families. It represents the best of traditional development practices, and there's nothing wrong with that approach." Victoria smiled, assuming this was leading toward her victory, but Dr. Rodriguez wasn't finished. "David's building is also beautiful, but it's beautiful in a different way. It's beautiful because it was designed by someone who understands what it means to need a home, not just a place to live. It's beautiful because it creates community, not just housing. It's beautiful because it sees residents as partners, not just tenants." The pause that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it was probably only seconds. Marcus found himself holding his breath, not because he was worried about winning or losing, but because he could sense that something larger was about to be revealed. "Which is why," Dr. Rodriguez said with a smile that transformed her entire face, "I'm recommending that the city fund both approaches. Victoria, your efficiency and construction expertise are exactly what we need for our rapid deployment housing initiative. David, your community-centered design philosophy is perfect for our long-term neighborhood revitalization projects." The room erupted in applause, but the real celebration was happening in the eyes of the community members who realized they wouldn't have to choose between quality construction and thoughtful design. They would have both. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. As the crowd began to disperse, Victoria approached David and Marcus with an expression they hadn't seen from her before: humility. "I owe you both an apology," she said quietly. "I've been so focused on building efficiently that I forgot why we build in the first place. David, would you consider consulting on my future projects? I think I could learn something from your approach." David extended his hand, and when Victoria shook it, something shifted in the room. The competition that had started with animosity was ending with the possibility of collaboration, proving that even the most entrenched positions could evolve when people were willing to listen and learn. 6 months later, both buildings were complete and fully occupied. Victoria's building had indeed been finished faster and under budget, providing quality housing that met all safety and efficiency standards. But David's building had become something more than housing. It had become a model for community development that was being studied by urban planners from around the world. The real measure of success, however, came from the residents themselves. Maria Santos, the single mother who had asked about play spaces, was now managing the community garden that fed 12 families and provided fresh produce to the local food bank. Her daughter was thriving in the on-site childcare centre that had been created in partnership with the local community college. James Wilson, a veteran who had been struggling with PTSD and unemployment, had found purpose in the building's maintenance program, which provided both income and a sense of belonging. The skills he learned had led to a full-time job with the city's housing authority, and he was now helping to design similar programs for other developments. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in David himself. The man who had been sleeping in a parking garage 18 months earlier was now the head of the city's community-centered design initiative, with a staff of 12 and a budget that would fund housing projects for the next decade. His notebook, once his only possession, had become the foundation for a new approach to urban development that prioritized human dignity alongside economic efficiency. Marcus, too, had been changed by the experience. His foundation had grown beyond charitable giving to become a catalyst for systemic change, partnering with communities to create solutions that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. The success of the housing projects had attracted attention from other cities, and Marcus found himself traveling the country, sharing what they had learned about the power of partnership between business expertise and lived experience. The story might have ended there, with everyone living happily in their new homes and the city celebrating its innovative approach to affordable housing. But life, as David had learned during his months of homelessness, rarely follows the neat trajectories we expect. The real test came during the building's first winter, when a massive storm system brought ice and snow that knocked out power throughout the city. While other buildings struggled with heating failures and frozen pipes, David's design proved its worth. The passive solar heating he had incorporated kept temperatures comfortable even without electricity, and the community spaces became warming centers for neighbors whose buildings weren't as well prepared. More importantly, the relationships that had been built during the construction process proved their value. Residents organized themselves into support networks, sharing food and resources, checking on elderly neighbors, and creating a sense of security that no amount of technology could have provided. It was during this storm that the true measure of what they had accomplished became clear. This wasn't just about building better housing. It was about building better communities, creating places where people could not only survive but thrive, regardless of what challenges they faced. The story of Marcus and David spread far beyond their city, inspiring similar projects across the country and around the world. But for the two men who had met in a parking garage on a rainy night, the real victory was much simpler and more personal. "Do you ever miss it?" Marcus asked David one evening as they stood on the roof garden of the building, watching the sun set over the city skyline. They were surrounded by families tending their plots, children playing between the raised beds, and neighbors sharing stories and laughter. "Miss what?" David replied, though he knew what Marcus was asking. "The simplicity, when all you had was your notebook and your ideas, before all the meetings and budgets and politics." David was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I miss the clarity," he said finally. "When you have nothing, it's easy to know what matters. But I don't miss the loneliness. I don't miss feeling invisible." And I don't miss believing that my ideas would never become reality." He gestured toward the families around them, toward the buildings that stretched into the distance, toward the community that had grown from sketches in a notebook. "This is what I dreamed about during those cold nights, not just buildings, but belonging, not just shelter, but hope." Marcus nodded, understanding completely. His own journey from homelessness to success had taught him that the greatest poverty wasn't lack of money, but lack of connection, lack of purpose, lack of belief in the possibility of change. "What's next?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. David smiled, pulling a new notebook from his jacket pocket. This one was filled with designs for schools that felt like homes, healthcare centers that looked like gardens, and community centers that brought people together across all the barriers that usually kept them apart. "Everything," David said simply. "We're going to build everything." As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, the two men stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sound of community life continuing around them. Children's laughter mixed with adult conversation, the rustle of plants in the evening breeze, and the distant hum of a city that was slowly learning to see its residents not as problems to be managed, but as partners in creating solutions. The transformation that had begun in a parking garage with a simple question, "What's your name?" had rippled outward in ways neither man could have imagined. But perhaps that was the point. Real change, lasting change, always began with one person seeing another person's humanity and choosing to act on that recognition. If this story has touched something in you, if it's reminded you of the power we all have to see beyond circumstances to potential, then consider sharing it with someone who needs that reminder today. Because somewhere in your community, there's a David waiting to be discovered, a Marcus ready to take a chance, or a partnership that could transform not just buildings, but lives. The question isn't whether these opportunities exist, but whether we have the courage to recognize them when they appear, often in the most unexpected places and at the most ordinary moments. The notebook that had once been David's only companion now sat in a place of honor in his new office, its pages preserved behind glass as a reminder of where the journey had begun. But the real legacy wasn't in the sketches or the buildings, or even the lives that had been changed. It was in the proof that when we choose to see each other's humanity, when we're willing to take risks on human potential, when we believe that everyone deserves not just shelter but dignity, we can create something beautiful together. And in a city that was slowly learning to build with both efficiency and empathy, that was the most valuable construction project of all.